So Sandy, I would like for you to demonstrate to the jury what you just described. First, I want to get an understanding about how far away you were from Mr. Boyd at the time that you deployed deadly force.
I believe that I was standing between 10 and 12 feet when I deployed deadly force.
So you were about 10 to 12 feet from where Mr. Boyd was?
Yes, ma'am.
And do you know where Officer Weimerskirtz was?
He was in front of me, so my right foot was the backside of Officer Weimerskirtz. So he was just in front of me, but still, when I leaned over top of him, he was there.
So how many feet was he in front of you, would you say?
I can't tell. He was within a foot. There was in front of his body from my back foot.
Okay. And in your testimony, you had described an elevation difference between you and Mr. Boyd.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. About what was the approximation of the elevation difference between you and Mr. Boyd that you recall?
It was where his feet stood and my feet stood was several feet. And when I say several, I'm not talking in upwards of greater than 5, but several feet.
Okay. Were you able to see about how tall Mr. Boyd was?
Judging Mr. Boyd, I would guess close to 6 foot.
Okay. Can you show me, Your Honor, can he, Mr. Sandy, step down? Yeah. Can you show me in relation to this black podium here, the distance between you and Mr. Boyd at the time you deployed deadly force?
Right here, I would estimate.
Okay. And you said between 10 and 12 feet?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you said it was several feet in elevation. Does the top of this platform, does this indicate a fair and accurate depiction of the elevation difference that you perceived that day between you and Mr. Boyd?
Objection, reading Your Honor.
Well, I'm not. Okay. Using this podium, can you show me where the elevation was between you and Mr. Boyd?
Close to that, close.
Okay. And you was between you and Mr. Boyd?
I would say close to that, close.
Okay. And you said, I guess Mr. Boyd was about 6 feet tall?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Can I get Mr. Bregman? Is Mr. Bregman about the same height as Mr. Boyd?
I would guess Mr. Bregman is close to 6 foot tall. Yes, ma'am.
And at this point, I guess I would ask if we could demonstrate for the jury having Mr. Bregman in the same position in the elevation difference that Mr. Boyd was on the day of the incident to Mr. Sandy.
Sure. Okay.
Do you want him to take the witness stand, Judge?
Good afternoon, Mr. Sandy.
Afternoon, ma'am.
Are you going to try to do a demonstration of the time when Mr. Boyd pulled out his knives?
That's my understanding, yes, ma'am.
All right. And you actually gave a statement 2 days after the shooting. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
After you had the same kind of time to reflect and get your thoughts together, as did Defendant Perez, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were specifically asked in that statement how far away you were at the time that Mr. Boyd pulled out his knives. Isn't that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
51, counsel. Line 4 through 7. And at that time, sir, you said, when I saw his knives come out, and like I said, Weimerskirch was in front of me, I know I was within 25 feet when the knives came out. Isn't that what you said at your statement, sir?
Okay, so I misunderstood your question, ma'am. When you asked about the demonstration, it was when I stepped over Officer Weimerskirch and deadly force was deployed. That was my understanding. I
Okay.
apologize.
So, sir, oh, you don't need to apologize to me, I just want to be clear about if the demonstration is going to be this time when Mr. Boyd pulled out his knives, at that time, you were 20 to 25 feet away from him, isn't that right, sir?
When his knives were first displayed, yes, ma'am, I was further back.
Okay, and the way he pulled out his knives was, he pulled them out like he'd been doing, like you'd seen him do, I think, 3 other times, is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And,
I'm gonna object, that's beyond the scope of what I
well, no, Judge, I think if they're gonna do a demonstration, I think we need to have the distance correct.
Well, then you should ask about the time he deployed his weapon.
All right, that's, when he deployed his weapon, that's what I was asking, Judge, I think. So when he deployed his weapon, that's when you were 20 to 25 feet away, is that right, sir?
When they were first deployed, yes, ma'am.
All right. At the time you fired, when you stepped around Officer Weimerskirch and fired, that's when you were 10 to 12 feet away?
Yes, ma'am.
And you have never gone out and done any measurements out there at the scene, have you?
No, ma'am, I have not.
As Barry Getz did, you haven't done any measurements like that?
No, ma'am.
And you know Mr. Getz said that it was 12.9 inches away from where Mr. Boyd was standing to where you were when you shot?
I recall his testimony.
You were asked about the height, and you said several feet. Is that what you said, sir?
Just now, yes, ma'am.
And several means 3 feet?
Objection, Your Honor, I think he answered the question, that it was several feet and it was less than
Oh,
5.
she can ask whether or not, what he means by several.
Say it again, please, ma'am.
Several feet, most people by using the word several mean 3 feet. Is that what you meant, sir?
Yeah, approximately, yes,
Okay.
ma'am.
And you've never gone out and measured actually what the slope was and how high Mr. Boyd was above you, have you, sir?
No, ma'am, no.
Are you aware how high this is, sir?
Guessing it's greater than 3 feet.
Yes, sir, it's 4 feet, isn't it?
I don't know exact measurements, ma'am.
Okay, it's a foot higher. If your estimate is 3 feet, this is a foot higher.
Objection, she's assuming facts that aren't in evidence.
Well, I can measure it, Judge.
No,
I'm sorry, Mr. Sadie. Can you see that this is 3.5 feet? Actually, a little bit more than that. 3 feet 9 inches, sir?
I can't see your tape, ma'am.
Okay.
If I,
Here's the 4 feet measure right here, sir.
yes,
And so from the ground to here, it's about 9 inches taller than the estimate that you're giving of how high Mr. Boyd was above you, sir.
Your objection, that's mischaracterizing the testimony.
And do you know how tall Mr. Bregman is?
I would guess I'm close to 6 foot, just estimating.
Do you know if it's 6'1", 6'2"?
No, ma'am.
How much taller he is when he wears his cowboy boots?
No, ma'am.
Okay, all right. At the time that you shot and were close to him, this 10 to 12 feet, that's the time that Mr. Boyd turned to his left. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right, Your Honor, can we approach to make our objection? Okay.
Mr. Sandy, I would like for you to come back off the witness stand, please, and demonstrate again where you were standing in relation to Mr. Boyd.
Yes, ma'am.
And Mr. Bregman, can you play the role of Mr. Boyd? So, Mr. Sandy, are you standing at about the distance, can you describe, I guess, is this an accurate depiction of your perception on that day?
Yes, ma'am.
In terms of elevation and distance?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, can you tell me, I'd like, you to position Mr. Lovato here where you recall Weimer Skirch being right before Mr. Boyd pulled his knife.
Here's Mr. Boyd. He said he was on one knee, but he was slumped over with his jaw, and his head was up. But prior to this, he was up and down and moving. So as I step out around him, and he finally steps here, I take the opportunity to step behind him, and there's a depression here, and I step in the depression. So I have a good solid base. So I come up with my rifle, I lean over top of Officer Weimer Skirch.
And excuse me, Your Honor, I'm going to object to Mr. Bregman putting his hands out to his sides, because at this point, I think he said he was turned to his left.
No, no,
Okay.
I want to make that clear.
Yeah.
I was,
Down until
Yeah.
there's testimony.
Okay.
I really don't want to turn on this.
yeah, so, at this point, what's Mr. Boyd doing?
So prior to this, he's already taken his knives out.
Okay.
They've already been out, and then to his side.
Okay, can you
And they
demonstrate
go-
that?
They go back out. So I know that his
I have
movement.
the fake knives around.
Where were Mr. Boyd's hands with the knives at this
And-
point?
And again, Your Honor, Mr. Bregman is putting his hands out
I'll put them here.
in a way that he's already described. He's 20 or 25 feet
We
away
don't
when that
avoid
happens.
Any kind of leading
sorry.
Okay.
by body positioning, so just
Okay.
wait for the witness to instruct.
So
So he had his knives
back
pulled,
here, he pulls his knives out of his pockets, and they come here.
and you're
So now
describing,
Mr.
But not
Bregman
on
can
here, though, not on
Mimic
here.
what the witness is doing.
Yes,
No.
Judge, but he says when he's back, not when he's there, when he's back 20 to 25 feet,
Okay,
that's when that happens.
So where I'm here.
okay?
Okay, so when I'm here, Mr. Boyd's hands go down, but they do come back up when, he begins that turn. So as I'm here, his hands are out, and as he begins his turn, he draws them in.
Okay, can you hold on? Can you put your hands the way he had them?
They were out.
They were out.
Here first, and then as I step over top of it, like I said, my foot, I have to put this foot out here in a depression, but I have to kind of lean over top of Weimer Skirch. So here, if he raises up, he's raising into my hands or the magazine of the rifle rises. So as I'm coming up, I see Mr. Boyd, and then he begins that quarter turn to the left. And then when I get my flashlight picture, it's blurry, it's gray, and I fire my first round. So
Can Mr. Bregman turn to the left, Your Honor?
Not real well, but
Well, he doesn't fall.
All
I
right.
can't tell you what his legs are doing in the turn. I can tell you his upper body.
I'll turn my upper body, I won't move
Yeah.
my legs now.
Is a quarter turn this way, kind of just is about that much when I press that first round, I know he's about to turn about like that.
And where are his knives when he's in that position?
There's hands.
Okay.
Okay. I think that's good.
Go ahead, keep going.
And when you're in this position right here, did you know where Mr. Perez was?
I didn't even know Officer Perez was there.
Okay. You can take a seat.
Thank you.
When you were in that position, did you know exactly where Mr. Ingram was? Where Officer Ingram was?
I didn't know where he was either. I knew he wasn't to my right or left, and I knew he wasn't between me and Mr. Boyd.
Okay. Did it ever appear to you, after Mr. Boyd drew his knives that final time, that he was surrendering?
No, ma'am.
I want to make sure that we're clear on a couple of things here. At the moment that you deployed deadly force, were all less lethal options available at that moment, at that time used on Mr. Boyd?
You're asking if all the less lethal options that we had available to us at that moment?
At that moment on that mountain, when you saw that threat?
Yes.
Okay. What was your job in that moment when Mr. Boyd drew his knives?
It was my duty as a lethal cover officer to provide cover and protection from Officer Weimerskirch and Sergeant Ingram from any deadly force threats that may have arose.
And why did you shoot Mr. Boyd 3 times?
As I stated, Mr. Boyd posed a deadly force threat. When I fired my first 2 rounds and assessed it, he was still standing. He was still in my scope. And I fired a 3rd round, and that's when he fell, when I saw the gray disappear from my scope. And I took it for granted that he had fallen until I brought my rifle to a low ready, and I could see him laying on the ground. That's when I just learned that he was no longer a threat.
I want to be clear about a few things. Did you ever choose to close distance on Mr. Boyd?
No,
Who made that choice?
it was Officer Weimerskirch.
Were you the one developing this plan at any time?
No.
Did you give an interview after the shooting?
I did.
Did you ever actually, right after the shooting, did you retain an attorney for that interview? How did that happen?
What happened was after some time that the shooting took place, we were still at the scene. We'd all been separated. I had already been processed in the crime van, and you are given the opportunity through the police department. You call a buddy officer, somebody just to help you get your stuff put together and get home. And while I was standing with my buddy officer, I was approached by Fred Maurer, who is a union attorney, and he questioned me as to when I wanted to give a statement. And I, never having been involved in an officer-involved shooting, I didn't know what the appropriate answer was. I kind of just left it to him. He left, walked away, come back after a short period of time and told me Tuesday, and then gave me a time, and I don't recall the time he gave me. It was the time that I gave the statement, and I agreed to it.
In that statement, why didn't you specifically tell Detective Stone that this wasn't your plan?
I was never asked about the plan in my questioning. My line of questioning started with Detective Stone is, I'm going to give you, how do you say it? Give you the table, I believe, is the words he used. I'm going to give you the table. Tell me your involvement in this incident. So that's what I did. I gave him my involvement in the incident.
Did you answer all of his questions?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you want to shoot James Boyd that day?
No.
And did you do anything contrary to your training in that moment?
No.
What do you believe to this day about whether your actions and the actions of Officer Perez saved Officer Weimerskirt's life?
Objection, Your Honor. As to compound.
Sustained as a compound.
What do you believe to this day about whether your actions saved the life of Officer Weimerskirch?
So after the shooting, before all this started, Officer Weimerskirch called me, and he was crying.
Excuse me, ma'am. Here's the-
Sustained as a hearsay.
Just what do you believe?
I saved his life.
Moment to confer, Judge. Okay. No further questions.
Any questions, Mr. Rubin?
Mr. Rodriguez.
Ms. Robin?
No question.
need the ladder, Your Honor. Mr. Sandy, let's start with how far away you were. Could you come back down off the
Yes, ma'am.
witness stand?
Yes, ma'am.
'Cause I think you said you were 20, just if I can figure out how to work this, 20 to 25 feet away when Mr. Boyd pulled out his knives. Can you, here, I'll hold this in. Why don't you go out 20, 25 feet rather than as close as you were, sir?
Yes, ma'am. Don't think we're gonna make it.
Okay?
17.
Okay, can we maybe do it on an angle, sir?
So
Want me to make it?
I know that 25.
Well, I'm trying to do it from this height, Judge, but,
So
there you
you
go.
can leave the tape at that height.
Okay,
Would that help?
yeah, I think so, go ahead.
So we go this way?
Yeah, let's just see how far it is, and then I'll put you in front of the judge perhaps.
I think this one, try to measure 25 feet at the chair.
Okay?
24. Is it tight? 25.
Okay, so that's how far you were at the time he pulled out his knives, is that right, sir?
Yes, not the same.
Yes, sir. And at that time, thank you very much, he did not advance on you.
There was, I observed his upper body move forward towards Officer Weimerskirch, but it was not me.
All right, he didn't close distance on you and Officer Weimerskirch from that 25 feet, did he, sir?
And during that 25 feet, he, like I said, I could see his upper body move forward
But
towards.
you never saw a step or anything?
I couldn't see his stuff, I wasn't looking at his legs.
Okay, so you and Officer Weimerskirch moved up on him, didn't you, sir? You closed distance on him.
Yes, ma'am.
All right.
But you still need them in the room.
Why don't you sit down and then I'll pull some things out and then we'll talk about that.
Okay.
The demonstration you did left out a number of things that were present at the scene at that time. One was that you were not wearing a suit at that time, is that right, sir?
No, ma'am, I was not.
Okay, I think you've testified you were wearing not just body armor, but you put plates in to try to resist so that a knife could not stab you, is that correct?
It was a, yes, ma'am, plate carrier, yes, ma'am.
All right. And you also had a gun on you, a rifle on you?
Yes, ma'am.
You had a sidearm on you?
Yes, ma'am.
You had a regular taser on you?
Yes, ma'am.
And any other weapons that I'm missing that we haven't gone through yet?
No, ma'am.
All right. Your Honor, I'd like permission to bring out the life-size blow-up of him, and then I'm going to bring him back and bring the other ones out. But I'd like to bring the life-size blow-up of him to show how he was dressed that day, with the court's permission.
Objection, Your Honor, I don't think the license blow is necessary to show how he was dressed.
Hold on.
Okay. And Judge, I'm also bringing out Exhibit 17. To remind me of where everybody was. This is 17 with the names on it, Judge, of the scene, where everybody was.
Are you using that for who was around in the close proximity that was discussed?
Correct. I'm also going to talk about that there was also an outer perimeter as well. That's just kind of to remind me, because I can't remember where everybody was myself, actually. So, may I display this picture, Richard? All right. And I'm sorry, Mike, can we find a, no, I just need an exhibit number. Okay, so 32D accurately depicts how you were dressed that evening,
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Sandy, and so when you were you said 10 to 12 feet away from Mr. Boyd after you moved up and when you were shooting, sir, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, and in addition, it was not just you, it was Officer Weimer's who was there, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And let me show you what's this exhibit like?
That would be 34E.
Okay, you recognize this as Officer Weimer's skirt and how he was dressed that evening?
I do, ma'am.
I didn't get the letter, the 34.
34E, Your Honor.
E.
D?
D is in David.
D as in David. And Officer Weimer's skirt is about 6 feet tall, is that right, sir?
He's close. He and I are close to the same height.
Okay, and so he was in front of you, but kneeling down, is that correct, sir?
Yes.
And he also had a dog with him, too? Is that correct, sir? He had a dog?
Yes.
And that dog was between you and Officer Weimerskirch and Mr. Boyd, isn't that right, sir?
Yes.
I'm sorry, we don't have a dog glove, I'm sorry. The dog was between the two of you. And in addition, sir, Mr. Ingram was there as well.
Your
Yes.
Honor, I'm going to object to lack of foundation for Ingram and Perez.
Concur, Your Honor, the testimony.
I'm sorry, sir, was Mr. Ingram right up there with you, too?
When everything started, yes, ma'am, they were up there. I didn't see them or know where they were at. I didn't know, what I testified to, ma'am, is I didn't know Perez was up there at all.
Oh, no, sir, and I'm not talking about Perez, I'm talking about Mr. Ingram.
Oh, okay.
Who was the road team.
Yes.
Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
He was right, where was he in relation to you?
Wait, before you point out,
Yep,
I'm sustaining the objection.
for Ingram, Your Honor?
Yes, his testimony was he didn't know where they
Okay, you didn't know where Mr. Ingram was?
When I was,
That's an answer.
were. Sustained.
Well, let me ask this question, Judge. Wasn't it Ingram that deployed the taser shotgun?
yes, ma'am.
And so you know he was off to your right, do you not, sir?
I don't know where he was when I was involved in the shooting, ma'am. I don't know where he'd gone to. I mean, I'm not saying he ran off the mountain, but I'm saying I didn't know where he was positioned.
And haven't you reviewed the videotape since then, sir?
Yeah, yes, ma'am, I've reviewed quite a bit
And
since
you
then.
know that he was right off to your right.
Your Honor, objection, it was asking the answer at the time, she's recreating at the time of the incident.
Well, Judge,
She can ask the question.
sure. You know from the video that he's right behind you to your right, don't you, sir?
Yes, ma'am, from reviewing the video, yes.
Yes, sir, and you know how he was dressed at that time, don't you, sir? And let me show you, this is, I'm sorry, never mind.
33E.
33D, that's how he was dressed at the time, sir?
Except for the jacket, yes, ma'am.
Okay, and he had on him, he was carrying 2 taser shotguns
Yes,
and
ma'am.
also a rifle, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Your Honor, may I place this to the right?
He-
Your
There's
Honor,
no objection, lack of foundation. We don't know
and
exactly.
misleading.
Okay. I'm going to sustain it because there's a critical piece of information.
Okay. Will you give me a hint, or should I guess?
Let me have you first.
Okay, thanks, Joe. From the video, sir, how far back was he from you?
I can't,
To your right?
I can't judge distance on the video, ma'am. It's too I know he was quite a distance behind me, but I can't tell you feet because it's a video, it's two-dimensional. I can look at you
Yes, sir.
and tell you how far you are. I can look at those doors and say how far they are, but on a video, I can't.
You can't say if he was within 20 feet of you?
I don't want to guess, ma'am. I'm sorry.
Well, sir, you've given us a guess on how tall the height was here, sir. So I'm asking you, you said you estimated it was 3 feet, and this is 3.9 feet. Can you estimate how far Mr. Ingram was away from you?
I think what you're asking me to do is I estimated how far Mr. Boyd was from me when I shot. I saw that for real. I can see this for real. The video, it's not, I don't want to say 20 feet, I want to say 30 feet, I can't tell.
All
I
right,
mean,
so you know that Mr. Ingram was back here, you just don't know where he was?
Yes,
Is that
ma'am.
correct, sir?
Yes,
All
ma'am.
right, so I'll turn him this way, Your Honor.
Well, you can put it back where you go.
Okay, all right, okay. And then we now know, sir, that Dominic Perez was behind you as well?
I do know now, yes, ma'am.
And you know that he was approximately, by his estimate, 25 feet behind you, sir?
I've heard measurements for that, yes, ma'am, 25 feet.
Or 25 feet away from Mr. Boyd, is that correct, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Let me show you this, you know how Officer Perez was dressed that
Your
day.
Honor, once again, lack of foundation as to where he was located.
Which I think he's testifying to that.
I think he also testified he didn't even know he was back there at the time.
Exhibit number, please.
37D.
This is how Dom Perez was dressed that day, sir.
Yes, ma'am.
Your Honor, I believe 37D, and you know who was back behind you to your left, don't you, sir?
I don't know, so when you ask me, if you're asking me at the time of the incident, or are you asking me from the video?
No, sir, I'm asking you from the video.
Oh, yes, ma'am, he was,
Okay.
Your Honor, has that exhibit been admitted?
I believe 37D, I think, sir.
I thought these are all for demonstrative.
They are
purposes.
correct, correct.
So I don't think they'll be admitted.
Okay.
They're being marked,
Okay.
and thought it was like against the wall.
It was, Judge. It was against the light right here, is where we figured out where it was. We're trying to get it lined up. Yep. And in addition to these officers, sir, you were aware that there were other officers around you, is that right?
I was aware of a perimeter, yes.
If this is the U-mound back here, you know that SWAT Officer Purdue was over here to your right?
I did not know where, and until I saw your map, I did not know where Mr. Purdue was.
You know that he was providing cover and he was radioing information to you,
Yeah, I do know
didn't
that.
you, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And you knew that there were some officers to the north, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And officers also down below, is that correct?
Down below, you mean on the running track, or?
Down by Piedra Vista, down by the bush where you started out. sir?
Oh, yes, ma'am.
Okay. And did you know that there were 19 officers out there that day? sir?
No, ma'am.
How? Okay. Yep. Sir, and with the understanding that this is about 9 inches higher than the estimate that you gave.
Objection, Your Honor, that's a mischaracterization together.
Sir, you estimated, I can ask the question, you estimated this to be about, that the height was about 3 feet? Is that right, sir?
Your Honor, same objection, that's not what he said.
That's,
At one point, they say approximately 3 feet.
that's correct.
Yes.
And so, if this is 3 feet 9 inches, that's about 9 inches higher than your estimate, is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And is this person that represents you in the approximate position of where you were demonstrating that you were at the time, sir?
I can't see the tape.
Tape is
I was-
right here, sir.
I think I was standing a little closer to the tape, ma'am.
Okay, you said it was between
10?
10 and 12 feet?
Yes.
Okay. Can I get your?
Sure.
Thanks. And can you take that out to you about 10? Okay, and if it's between 10 and 12, is that about 11 right there, sir? Halfway between your estimate?
11.9, yes, ma'am.
Okay, all right, thank you, sir. And it's my understanding that what you saw, sir, hold on just a second, Judge.
Yes, ma'am.
And that was the sweatshirt that had the Gap logo on it?
Yes, ma'am.
And you could see the Gap logo through your scope, could you not, sir?
No, not the entire time. That's fine. When I was initially coming up and my eye was going into my scope, I could see the Gap, but once I attained my flash sight picture and began to fire, all I could see was gray, ma'am.
Yes, sir, but you knew that it had a Gap logo on the front of it, did you not?
I did.
All right, and so before you fired, he turned like this, did he not, sir?
Not quite that much.
Quarter turn here?
Quarter turn.
And that was your first shot? And then he continued to turn, did he not, sir?
I couldn't see him in my scope turning.
Okay. And the next thing you saw after your third shot was him going down this direction, sir?
I saw him fall out of my scope, ma'am. I didn't see how he fell.
Okay. Thank you. That's the demonstration. It's harder doing heels, Your Honor. Can we take these down? Yes. Okay, now that I've had my workout for the afternoon, Mr. Sandy. Mr. Sandy, do you agree with the Defense Police Practices expert, Ron McCarthy, that a police officer who's out on the street trying to prove something is a danger to both citizens and other officers?
Yes, ma'am.
You testified that you left the state police under a cloud, is that right, sir?
I was terminated, yes, ma'am.
And you admitted during that investigation that you had been double dipping, is that right?
Yes,
You were getting paid by the New Mexico State Police with taxpayer money
yes,
at the same time that you were getting paid by the security company Wackenhut, is that right, sir?
yes, ma'am.
And the amount was thousands of dollars, was it not, sir?
I think it was 3,000.
Okay. And the New Mexico State Police considered that an act of dishonesty, did it not, sir?
We weren't ever, I was never alleged to be dishonest, ma'am.
Was it an act unbecoming of an officer?
Yes,
And they terminated you involuntarily, is that right?
yes, ma'am.
And that was an embarrassment for you, was it not?
I wasn't proud of it.
That happened in May of 2007?
No, yes, I'm sorry.
Okay. And about that same time, at the end of 2006, beginning of 2007, APD lowered its standards for lateral hires from other departments, did it not, sir?
I was never told any of that, ma'am.
Okay. You were hired almost within months after being terminated at the New Mexico State Police by the Albuquerque Police Department, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Did you go through a lateral training course where you learned about the reactive control model?
In the Lateral Academy, we went through all of their training, and it was, what I recall is the reactive control model was a portion of their use of force policy that we went through. Yes,
So you were trained on the reactive control model in 2007 when you went through the Lateral Academy, is that right?
yes, ma'am.
Being part of the rope team was something that you had always wanted, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Even when you were with state police?
Yes, ma'am.
And when you came to APD, you wanted to go to the rope division, did you not, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Rope was not a group of field officers, it was a group of tactical officers, is that right?
It was, yes, ma'am.
It's not quite as prestigious as the SWAT team, is that right?
Describe prestigious.
Well, let's do chain of command. In the chain of command, when SWAT arrives at a scene, they get to assume control of the scene, even if rope is there. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And what rope did was deal with hunting down repeat offenders. Is that correct?
Not solely, ma'am, but that was the primary mission.
Repeat offender program. Is that right?
Project, yes, ma'am.
Project, I'm sorry. And
okay.
you would hunt them down to serve arrest warrants sometimes. Is that right?
Yes,
Okay. And your primary focus at rope was not crisis intervention with mentally ill citizens, was it, sir?
no, ma'am.
And you idolized the men who ran rope?
The men who'd been in rope, yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir. Lou Heckroth, Zach Stevenson,
Yes, ma'am. They were
And-
good detectives.
and their respect was important to you.
Yes, ma'am.
And you had only been in rope about 1.5 years at the time this shooting occurred, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And I think you touched on having made a mistake in a block where the guy got away, is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And that was a huge mistake, was it not?
It was in my eyes, yes, ma'am.
And you took a lot of beating up over it from most of the guys on the rope team, did you not, sir?
Yes, took some bantering, yes, ma'am.
And the teasing got so bad at rope sometimes that rope even developed a safe word for when people's feelings started to get hurt, didn't they, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
They had a safe word where if somebody was teasing you too hard, you could say the safe word China, and that would make them stop giving you a hard time, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Let's talk about how you got out there that day. Excuse me just one second, Your Honor. At 5:23, dispatch requested a taser shotgun. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And you talked about that in your statement. What you said was, I received a call from radio control, and the control dispatcher told me that Sergeant Jason Carpenter from the Foothills Area Command was requesting a taser shotgun.
Yes, ma'am.
And what you said in your statement was you received a call from radio control. You understand how a layperson would not understand that was a cell phone call, but might think that was a radio call.
I don't know. What I was saying was
Your Honor,
given to,
objection calls for speculation.
And relevance, Your Honor.
Okay. Do you remember my question?
I don't.
Susan?
I'm sorry.
You didn't say it was a cell phone call, did you, sir? In your statement, you said it was a call from radio control.
Yes.
Okay. And within 4 minutes, at 5:27, you got a second call from control stating that Sergeant Carpenter had requested gangs and the caller had called rope by accident. Isn't that correct, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And at that point, you told them to cancel the call to gangs and you would stay en route. Is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
That was your decision, was it not, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And then you got on the phone 4 minutes later at 5:31 and you contacted Rick Ingram from the rope team. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you notified him of your call out
Yes, ma'am.
and you asked him to respond with you to the scene. Did you not, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And you asked him to call K-9.
Yes, ma'am. I did.
And shortly thereafter, Rick Ingram, Jeff McFarland, and Scott Weimerskirch all got together on Rope Air, is that right, and had a conversation?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were the one at that time that briefed them about control calling you and what the call was about, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you talked about all of them, that is, Rick Ingram, Jeff McFarland from SWAT, and Scott Weimer-Skirch, the canine officer, all coming to the scene with you. Is that right?
I don't understand what you're asking, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. At that point, you all talked about all four of you going to the scene at Piedra Vista.
They were en route already. I talked about just meeting them there and waiting for them to arrive.
And you, at that point, grabbed your rifle and your taser shotgun. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And then, when you first arrived down at the staging area, you met Chris Ware down there on the street.
Yes, ma'am.
And even though you'd been to church that day, the thing you said to him right when you were down there was that you were going to shoot that fucking lunatic with a taser shotgun in a minute. Isn't that right, sir?
I did, ma'am.
And I think you've talked about then going out and looking at Mr. Boyd and what was going on through your optic, your magnified scope. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And I think you've said you were the one that decided you thought they were not safe. Is that right?
I had made mention to, because I could see it through my scope. Yes, ma'am.
And you told somebody who then called up and called them down. Is that right?
I said it aloud. Yes, ma'am.
And you said, we decide it is not safe for them because they are too close, and called off CIT and the field officers. Is that right?
Objection, Your Honor, it mischaracterizes the testimony. You didn't say he called them off.
No, I said we decide it's not safe because they are too close. Yeah. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am. And further in my statement, it says to create a little distance, open up the reactionary gap.
Right. And that place where they were standing is the same place where you all ended up right before you approached Mr. Boyd, isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Mr. Boyd was, you call it ranting. Mr. Boyd was complaining about how he was being assaulted by uniformed officers and they had pointed guns at him first.
Yes, ma'am.
Did you ever do anything to try to determine if he was correct, that that's how it had happened? That they'd pointed guns at him first before he ever pulled out a knife?
Objection, all this.
And he was upset at you in particular, sir, for pointing your rifle at him, was he not, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And in fact, that was the first time he pulled out his knives while you were there, is because he saw you pointing your rifle at him, and he became agitated about that.
Yes, ma'am.
And that caused him to pull out his knives, and he said, you officers are continuing to assault me by pointing rifles at me. Isn't that right?
Yes, ma'am.
This is the time he pulled out just one knife.
Yes, ma'am.
And there was, in the group of you, an officer with a beanbag shotgun, Anthony Sedler, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And you sent him away to the perimeter?
Objection, mischaracterizes the facts. Not a-
You can answer the question.
I didn't send him away, ma'am.
Right, he left and went to the perimeter somewhere?
I learned later that he went to the northern perimeter. I didn't know where, at the time he left, I didn't know he had left. I thought for quite a while that he was still with us until we moved and he wasn't there.
Right, you knew he had a beanbag shotgun there at the
I
scene.
did.
And you've talked about throwing the sandwich and a dinner roll from churches, and that's how you described the dinner roll was, he also had a dinner roll from like Church's Chicken. Isn't that how you described it, sir?
That's exactly how I described it, ma'am.
Okay. And then you all began to put a plan or discuss a plan at about 7:15, actually 7:06. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And Mike, can we play that, and what is the exhibit number 706 when the three of you were discussing? And it, first of all, it was you, Rick Ingram, and Scott Weimer-Skirch discussing a plan. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
That's 10I. We have the HDMI on the defense table.
And you said 10I?
Yes, Your Honor.
You want defense legal?
Yes.
Yes. nice children.
Get up to there and get him with the dog. See where that. The biggest thing with the taser shotgun, if it doesn't work, you just put a jellyfish on him, and the dog's out of play.
Mr. Sandy, can you tell me who the other officer was that was talking about we can put a taser shotgun on him?
I believe that was Rick Ingram.
Okay, and that is you to the left and that is Rick Ingram to the right. Is that correct in that picture?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
It's being filmed from Sergeant Weimer-Scourge's helmet, or taser cam, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
So you can't see him because he's the one filming it, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am. Mhm.
And that happened at 7:06, and based on that discussion, did all of you know that if you used the taser shotgun, that you wouldn't be able to use the dog?
We did, ma'am.
Okay. Then there was another conversation at 7:16, and can you play that, please, Mike? And if you let me know, that's 10J, Your Honor.
Nothing dynamic. They don't have much. Until we have or we put our hand. We got more tools coming at this point. Don't think either.
Okay. And that's, again, Sergeant Weimer-Scourge talking at the beginning. And
That is Officer Weimer-Scourge talking, yes, ma'am.
And what he says is, if we use the taser shotgun and it doesn't work, we were out of options. Isn't that what he says?
Yes, ma'am. I didn't hear that conversation. There was times that they would talk behind me, and Ingram and Weimer-Scourge would have conversations, and I was focused on Mr. Boyd. And if Mr. Boyd was talking and being animated, I couldn't hear all that they were saying.
Okay. And we can do it. Jeff Stone says that's you saying we can do it.
But talking about moving up to that rock, yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
And then what he says at 7:16, what Weimer-Scourge says at 7:16, is let's wait for less lethal options. Isn't that what he says?
Yes, ma'am, that's what he said.
Okay. And at 7:20 is when Sergeant Fox arrived. Isn't that correct, sir?
I don't know the time he arrived, ma'am.
Okay. Wasn't part of your plan to trick Mr. Boyd into coming down so that you could arrest him?
No, ma'am.
All right. Didn't you tell Mr. Boyd, or the three of you with Officer Weimer-Scourge during the talking, tell Mr. Boyd over and over again to come down the hill?
Yes, ma'am.
And you didn't require him, when you asked him to come down the hill, to put down his knives when you asked him to come down the hill?
Yes, ma'am. He was told numerous times, put down your knives and come down and talk to us.
All right, sir. In the last 15 minutes after Sergeant Fox arrived, I'm going to play a number of tapes from Sergeant Weimer-Scourge's taser cam,
Okay.
where you ask him to come down the hill and you never ask him to put down your knives. Your Honor, we're going to play 10. Well, let me play them, Judge. Okay, let me play the tapes. This is 10X1, Judge.
You're not informing me about how you are going to use this matter in national security after I leave. Well, we can talk about that down the hill, or we can get right now.
Okay. And in that discussion, there was no request for him to put down his knives. Is that right, sir?
No, ma'am.
Okay, and then 10X2, Your Honor.
We're gonna go home and you get your stuff and walk down there.
What's that?
We, all of us, you included, is you get your stuff and you walk down the hill. That's how we're gonna go home.
And in that clip, he didn't ask him to put down his knives before he walked down the hill. Is that right, sir?
No, ma'am.
And then 10X3, Your Honor.
Please, sign this hill.
Can you start that one over, Mike? The very first part of it.
But no one can tear, harm, or kill you. We just want you to come down off the side of this hill.
And again, that is 10X3. And again, no request for him to put down his knives, just asking him to come down the hill. Is that right, sir?
No, ma'am.
And then 10X4, Your Honor?
Right now, I'm not gonna lie to you, man. I need you to come down here.
Again, no request to put down the knives, sir. And then 10X5, Your Honor.
All right, grab your stuff.
And again, no request for him to put down his knives. Is that correct, sir?
No, ma'am.
And one of your SOPs says that you are not supposed to lie to mentally ill people. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
In fact, Judge, if you can switch it over to the Elmo. I think this is State's Exhibit 2, SOP 2-13, response to the mentally ill, suspected mentally ill and people in crisis. And what it says in Section D, sir, is always be truthful. If the subject perceives deception, he, she may withdraw and further complicate the situation. Isn't that how you were trained, sir?
Yes, ma'am. That's-
Before you executed this plan, for want of a better term, you were told over the radio by Jim Perdue that he had put on this sweatshirt. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And you had seen him put on this sweatshirt that said Gap on the front.
Yes, ma'am.
And Jim Perdue was warning you because he said your taser shotgun may not work with all these extra layers.
Yes, ma'am.
So you knew that the taser shotgun might fail before you started implementing this plan. Is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And despite that, once Mr. Boyd picked up his bags, you hit him with a flashbang, is that right?
Yes, ma'am.
And then deployed the taser
Yes, ma'am.
and deployed the dog at the same time.
Yes, ma'am.
And again, it was you.
I would object to the characterization. Is she asking if he deployed the dog, if he deployed the taser?
The three of you executed your plan, is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And the dog ran up to Mr. Boyd. Mr. Boyd put his hand out, and the dog turned around and came back. Isn't that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And didn't Mr. Boyd pull out his knives in response to the dog running at him?
Yes, ma'am. Well, after the dog went up there, yes, ma'am.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
I said after the dog ran up to him, he did display his knives.
And again, you have admitted to this jury, you said and described this in your statement as a defensive posture. Is that right?
I did, ma'am.
And at that point, you made the decision that because of the proximity and the knives that I was going to engage him with my rifle. Isn't that what you said in your statement, sir?
Yes, ma'am, it is.
And when he displayed the knives, he was 20 to 25 feet away from you.
Yes, ma'am.
Yours was an intentional decision to shoot Mr. Boyd, is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am, it was.
Not an accident?
No, ma'am, it was not.
Not a mistake?
No, ma'am, it was not.
Even though he had turned away to his left before you shot your first shot, is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And that was after the three of you had promised him safe passage, is that right?
Objection on this characterization.
Okay. Your Honor, if we can play, Sergeant Weimerskirch actually had an audio tape of the taser cam on him when all of this happened too, is that right, the taser cam tape?
Yes, ma'am.
And I think the jury has seen the Perez video, but I don't think they've heard Sergeant Weimerskirch's taser cam tape, and I'd like to play that now, Judge. I think it's been admitted, and there's a transcript with it as well. And can you tell me what the exhibit number is? 10H2. All right, I think this is the transcript that we agreed to, Judge, and then, so we'll move 10H2, which is the audio tape that I think, and the transcript has already been admitted.
An objection of 10H2.
Lack of foundation?
Okay, Your Honor, if it's okay, may we play that transcript? Okay, thank you very much.
If you were down in a bar or a bus stop, I have the right to kill you right now. You're trying to get stupid.
We're not gonna get stupid.
If we walk down here, you're cleaning up assault, and everybody's gonna get hurt again? Alright, I'll change up your agreement. I'm gonna try to walk with you.
All right.
Let's go. Let our arms. Two words. Keep you safe. Alright? Don't worry about safety, not a fucking murder. Alright?
Run! 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 Get on the ground! Fuck! Fuck! Fuck!
Don't be
Forward! Forward!
Mr. Sandy, I want to direct your attention to, you said that Officer Weimerskirch told you to bang him, but what he really said was bang this fucker now, bang him. Isn't that what he said, sir?
That's what he said there.
And you don't
I
dispute?
didn't recall him saying, I didn't recall him saying bang this fucker.
All right, and I want to ask you about that term that appeared when you arrived and now appears again at the end of the tape. Is that how the three of you thought of Mr. Boyd at that time?
No, ma'am.
And the concern is this, as experienced law enforcement officers, you and Officer Weimerskirch were supposed to recognize when a person was suffering from mental illness. Is that right, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And you recognized that Mr. Boyd was a man suffering from mental illness, didn't you, sir?
Yes, ma'am.
And you were not supposed to hold them personally responsible for being mentally ill, were you, sir?
No, ma'am.
And you were not supposed to get angry at them or be susceptible to taunts or threats by a mentally ill person, were you, sir?
No, ma'am.
And yet that comment by Sergeant Weimerskirch sounds angry.
Objection calls for speculation.
You can answer his perception of the comment.
Ma'am, to be honest with you, I did not hear, I heard bang him, is what I heard. That's what I heard, bang him. So I didn't hear the fucker part of it.
Okay. Were you and Weimerskirch angry at Mr. Boyd when you started the assault?
No.
Your Honor, I'd move Exhibits 10X 1 through 5 into evidence. Those are the clips that we played, and let me check, and I think I'm done. Those were the 5 clips that we played of asking him to walk down the mountain.
Any objection to 10X, I through 5?
No objection.
No objection, Your Honor.
10X, 1 through 5 are
Your Honor, I'll pass the witness.
redirect.
Keep it brief, Your Honor. First of all, you were asked questions about this safe word China. Do you remember that?
Yes, ma'am.
Can you tell me how was that developed?
So, in the rope unit, I'd mentioned there's a detective there, 30 years, he's 30 years old, and he's been married 3 times. One day in the office, when we were joking around, one of the detectives were making fun of him and his women's problems, and in that joking around, he got out of his desk and said, "This is your safe word," and wrote, we had a little dry erase board, said China, "This is your safe word," and then everybody was laughing, and that detective said it came through them when they were making fun of that detective for having his women problems.
So is that word developed regarding you?
No.
Okay. Were you actually, when you were asked about rope bear and the conversation between you and McFarland, were you the one who called McFarland on rope bear?
No, he was scanning rope air, and just once Ingram and I stopped talking and there was a break, he came up on rope air and started talking.
You were shown many clips. Well, first of all, do you recall being questioned about Anthony Sedler? Officer Sedler? and
I
when
do.
he came? Okay. Did you ever send Officer Sedler away?
No, I did not.
Okay. You were shown many, I guess, second-long clips here where Mr. Boyd was being told by other officers to, there was discussion about him coming down the mountain. Do you remember that?
Yes.
How many times in your encounter was Mr. Boyd told to leave his knives behind or to put his knives down?
Numerous times. Some of those clips I remember and being said, and it was preceded by, put your knives down, and come down to us.
In your perception, was the attempt made clear to Mr. Boyd that officers wanted him to leave his knives behind before coming down?
I feel that it was very clear.
You were also questioned about lying, if it's appropriate to lie. Did Officer Monette lie when saying to Mr. Boyd that he was going to give him a hotel voucher?
Yes.
Were you guys ever going to give Mr. Boyd a hotel voucher and just go let him be in a hotel that night after he assaulted officers?
No.
Did you ever directly tell Mr. Boyd anything?
No.
You never lied to Mr. Boyd?
I never spoke to Mr. Boyd.
You were questioned about the fact that you were 20 to 25 feet from Mr. Boyd at the time when he displayed the knives for the fourth time.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you remember that?
Yes, ma'am.
You said you were 20 to 25 feet at the initial moment he displayed them, right?
Yes, ma'am.
How far was Officer Weimerscourge at the moment you used deadly force?
He was much closer. I would say closer to the 12 to 15 foot mark. He was much, much closer than I was to Mr. Boyd.
No further questions, Your Honor.
Thank you, ma'am.
Just one moment, Your Honor. Your Honor, Keith Sandy rests
come back tomorrow instead of 8:20 as you've been doing, I'm gonna ask that you return at 10. So just show up at the first floor jury assembly room at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning, and then I'll instruct you on the law. So the same reminders not to discuss the case with any other juror or with any other person. Don't let anyone discuss the case with you or in your presence. Do not conduct any independent research or visit the scene. Avoid all news accounts. Do not read, listen, or watch any news accounts about the trial. Do not express any opinion about the case or form any fixed opinions until the case is finally submitted to you for your decision. Thank you again for your time today, and have a pleasant evening. Please stand.